Navarro, and I was born in Havana, Cuba. My father was a proud owner, manager of the Hotel Vidado, which was the first fully air-conditioned hotel in Cuba. Our family lived in the 7th floor penthouse level. The tourist business was good, and the future looked very bright for our family. In 1958, Cuba was relatively well off as a country. It had the second highest per capita income in all of Latin America. And in terms of other social economic indicators such as literacy, infant mortality, and life expectancy, Cuba was among the top 5. It ranked first in the number of TV sets in all of Latin America, and it also ranked first in the number of TV stations. As far as a worldwide scale, when it came to wages, in industrial wages paid to workers and agricultural wages, the employees were 7th and 8th ranked in the world. So if everything was so good, why would the Cubans want to change? It was because the people were not happy with Fulgencio Batista, who was the current dictator. In 1952, he had forced his way into power via a government coup. The Cuban middle class was not happy with Batista's corruption. They were not happy he was raising taxes, and also he was skimming from the casino profits directly to him. So how did Fidel Castro enter this picture? Fidel was born in Cuba. He was born to a wealthy sugar grower. He went to the university and became an attorney. He was a very persuasive person, and his oratory skills were outstanding. At the University of Havana, he had been exposed to various ideologies, including fascism and communism. Before he graduated, he became a guerrilla fighter, and he got involved in an attempt to overthrow the governments in both the Dominican Republic and in Colombia. After he graduated, his interest as an attorney diminished and his interest in politics increased. In '52, he ran for an open seat in Congress. During the election cycle, then General Fulgencio Batista overthrew the government and terminated elections. He tried several times to overthrow the Batista government, all of them unsuccessful. And in 1956, him, Che Guevara, and his brother Raul Castro retreated to the Sierra Maestra Mountains. They began a campaign of guerrilla warfare. In 1957, from the mountains, Castro published what was called the Sierra Maestro Manifesto, which included a number of reforms he would enact once he was in power. The most important ones would be that the provisional government would hold free elections as per the 1940 Constitution. There would be absolute freedom of information of the spoken and written press, and all the individual rights guaranteed by the Constitution would be retained. Now, the Cuban people saw Castro as an agent of change, but they were just unaware of the type of change that he would bring forth. Eventually, most of these promises would turn out to be false. In order for Castro to gain acceptance with the world leaders and the media, he repeatedly denied he was a communist. In 1957, the New York Times published an article on Castro's intentions. The article stated, "The program amounts to a New Deal for Cuba, radical, democratic, and therefore anti-communist." In '58, Castro told Coronet magazine, "We want to establish for all citizens the personal and political rights set forth in our much ignored Constitution." Then in 1959, in an interview with U.S. News World Report, Castro stated, "Our movement is a party of radical ideas, but it is not a communist movement." You see, Castro knew how to manipulate the media. Unfortunately, many Cubans and many Americans bought into it. By the end of 1958, his actions had so weakened Batista that Batista on New Year's Eve '58 suddenly left the country, leaving a vacuum that Castro quickly filled. Castro began to parade around the country, shaking hands and making promises of change and reform. Many people had reservations, but they wanted to give him a chance. In his first speech, Castro proclaimed there would be free elections, and I quote, "as soon as possible." socialist accessibility to the people, saying, and I quote again, "You will have other opportunities to hear me on the radio, in the press, and on TV. We will meet in the schools, the neighborhoods, and everywhere. Anyone can talk to me. The demands of all will be met." The Castro propaganda machine went into full force immediately. Castro began to appear almost every day on TV, sometimes twice a day. He was on the radio 2 or 3 times a week. He would either make a statement or he would be in an event. You could not get enough of Fidel Castro. In his first year alone, he made 80 speeches, some of them as long as 4.5 hours. Right from the beginning, he made it very clear that anyone who opposed the revolution did not have the right to possess weapons. In an early speech, he stated, and I quote again, "Why are they amassing weapons secretly now? Why are they smuggling weapons in currently? I will give you this warning. I am prepared to do whatever I have to do to resolve this problem." His first radical action was to shut down the casino industry. This would correspond back to a promise he had earlier said that he would purify the nation. Strict government controls took away the excitement, and the tourists, frankly, never returned. Eventually, they would be closed down for good. Shortly after that, Castro named Che Guevara to appoint a committee to develop the legislation to enact what was called the Agrarian Reform Act. This act led with the confiscation of land and parceling out to peasants who did not own the land, but became government commune farm workers. This was Castro's plan for land redistribution. By early summer in '59, the euphoria had begun to fade and apprehension had set in. The free elections that were promised, nobody was talking about that anymore. The news media, believe it or not, hardly published anything against Castro or any of his aides. In fact, a new news media outlet was formed by Fidel, and with his backing and his blessing, it would only report the approved government version of all the news. You could think of it as CNN, Castro's news network. By the end of that summer, Castro began to nationalize all private businesses industry. As the counter-revolutionary movement began to grow, the government set forth a new death penalty decree for anyone caught in counter-revolutionary activities. They issued a second decree, and that would be the death penalty for anyone caught in any activity that the government deemed was against the economy. Pretty broad parameters. Now the apprehension turned to fear. Every night, between 10 to 15 people were arrested, not just in Havana, but throughout Cuba for counter-revolutionary activities. Many people became desperate. They began to go to embassies to seek asylum. Others tried a more drastic course of action. They tried to put together small rafts, and they tried to flee Cuba in small boats so the Coast Guard could not pick them up. Unfortunately, 85 to 90% of these people would die in the water, and they would not make it. By the end of 1959, the revolution had totally polarized the country. You were either for the revolution or you were against it. There was no middle ground. You could not trust anybody. You couldn't trust your friends. You couldn't trust your neighbors. You could not even trust members of your own family.